Welcome to the National Wilderness Stewardship Alliance webinar for February. I'm Dave Cantrell. I'm chair of the NWSA Programs Committee. Our usual host, Randy Welsh, our executive director, is at Hike the Hill today. So it's a special pleasure for me to introduce today's presenter, who's a longtime colleague and friend. Kevin Cannon, the recently retired recreation forester for the Roosevelt National Forest and Pawnee National Grassland on the Canyon Lakes and Pawnee Ranger districts. Kevin has been the Forest Service liaison to my home group, Poudre Wilderness Volunteers, for the last 18 years. Together, we've sat through a good many board meetings, often with lots of potential for disagreement between agency and volunteer group. Kevin and I have also worked together on more projects than I can remember and worked through a fair amount of pastry and French toast in the process. Through those hundreds of hours of Forest Service volunteer cooperation, he's always respected the scope of work volunteers can do and has demonstrated his mastery of the principles of communication and cooperation he's going to talk about now. Just to mention before Kevin starts, please notice that you can send us questions. We'll hold those to the end, and that you can also chat individually to us if there's something that you need to ask about, any technical troubles, things of that sort. So with that, I'll see if I can turn this over to Kevin.
Okay, are we okay, Dave?
Darned if I know. I'm seeing a list of all of the presenters. Everybody, please notice that you don't have the usual professional crew here. Hi, Kelly. Hi, Mel. I see all you guys here. Okay, Kevin, I think maybe you're up and running. Let's see. I'm going to ask.
I see my screen is being shared.
Okay, let's go ahead and talk and see if you're up. I'm going to check.
Okay, thank you, Dave, for that wonderful introduction. As Dave said, I'm recently retired from the Forest Service. I gave this presentation last April, I believe it was, at the Central Rockies Wilderness Volunteer Workshop. And we talked about after that doing it for NWSA, and that's what I'm here today to do. So I'm going to turn off my webcam, no sense looking at me. So let's see. There we go. No. There we go. Okay. So agency relations, or how to relax on a pair of roller skates. Don't worry about the last part of the title. It's just a way of trying to be funny. But sometimes dealing with volunteers does feel a bit like you're going in a lot of different directions at the same time. Let's see. So we're going to talk about what the guidelines are first, and then we'll get into relationships between the liaisons and the volunteers themselves. So let's see, that should be advancing. There we go. So what are the guidelines? They're going to vary for each agency. I'm most familiar with the Forest Service, so we will I will kind of focus on that and just understand that if you're from a different agency or working with a different agency, you'll need to find out some of their peculiar or sometimes Forest Service guidelines seem rather peculiar even to me. But you can ask them what their special guidelines are. For what I'm going to talk about today, it will concern mostly the Forest Service, and what you should be able to see on your screen right now is an agency volunteer program mission statement of the Forest Service. A rather simple, simplistic mission statement about utilizing volunteers to the fullest extent and trying to make them happy, basically is what that slide is about. Moving on. So what can volunteers do in carrying out the mission of the Forest Service? So they can, the volunteers can assist in all sorts of programs and activities. Some of them I'm sure you have no idea the Forest Service did. Some of them are very selective to different parts of the Forest Service in different areas. But if you're interested in it, my recommendation is to talk to somebody in the Forest Service and see if you can help them out with that. It is always helpful as a manager to find somebody else who has an interest in doing a certain program, whether that program is one of the key ones or not. They're all important to getting the mission of the agency done. The two things in the Forest Service that volunteers cannot do are law enforcement and union representation. Law enforcement, of course, you have to carry weapons, and no volunteer, at least down in the lower 48, is allowed to carry a weapon while they're volunteering. So, and then union representation, I'm not sure why anybody would want to volunteer for that, but there are people I'm sure who may enjoy that. So sorry, that is not a program that the Forest Service allows volunteers to assist in. There are, however, a very wide range of programs that volunteers can help out on, as long as they're not replacing current employees or contracts of that sort, as you can see from the slide. I'm not going to spend an awful lot of time there. So what is a volunteer? Most of you know this. A volunteer is a person who donates time and talent to advance the mission of the Forest Service and who receives no salary or wages from the Forest Service for their voluntary service. And then also it goes into the explanation of what a volunteer group is. Basically an organization whose members donate time to advance the mission of the Forest Service. Again, not going to spend a lot of time here. If you're on this call, I'm sure you understand what both of those definitions are. So we'll switch to the next screen. Here you'll find a list of what you're probably most familiar with, because a lot of times volunteers volunteer in recreation-based activities. So whether that's hiking on trails, skiing on trails, helping in dispersed or developed campgrounds, helping with caves, a whole bunch of different recreation type activities. This is, at least in the Forest Service, this is generally what is associated with volunteers. However, there's a whole bunch of other things that volunteers can do. And the slide that's coming up should show you ecosystem, forest, and natural resource management type of opportunities that volunteers can do. vegetation, watershed, and air, natural resource management type of activities, wildlife, fish, and threatened and endangered species, and heritage resources. Of all these, probably heritage resources is the next best known, with Passports in Time, where volunteers go out to work on cultural or heritage resources that the archaeologists with the agencies are working on. They are fascinating things. I've been on a couple with the Forest Service helping out, and I must say they are quite enjoyable to learn about the heritage resources of your area. Quite exciting. But as you can see, there are many different opportunities. Also, there are more. And here's another list for things that people normally don't think of. Engineering, road maintenance, safety and sustainable operations, information resource management, which is generally computers, geographic information systems, that type of thing. Lands, minerals, geology, and special uses, if you have special talents in those areas. There are folks out there looking to have help in that. Research and development, not sure what our researchers do. I worked close to the Rocky Mountain Research Station for 18 years, and I've talked to them for a number of times, but they seem to get a lot of their folks from universities. So I'm not sure what type of volunteer opportunities would arise there, but I'm sure they could use the help. And then state and private forestry and fire. Not that with fire, you might not be put in fighting a fire, but there are things behind the scenes, such as at camp, helping distribute tools, sharpen tools, general cleanup, administration of the site where firefighters stay, those types of things where volunteers have helped out in the past. So quite a wide range with the Forest Service, and I would say probably the same with the Bureau of Land Management for those that are near Bureau of Land Management areas. The Park Service, they're probably a little bit more geared towards the science and recreation spectrum of things, of course. And then Fish and Wildlife, they would also be more towards the science of the wildlife refuges, with some on recreation also. So let's move along. So now that was what can a volunteer do and not do, and I'll recap what you can't do is law enforcement and union representation. Other than that, talk to your liaison with your agency and see what you can do for them, and make sure it's something that you're interested in, because you'll find it a lot more interesting to do if you're interested in it, and they can have somebody organize it for you to help you out. So your liaison, after being a liaison for 18 years here on the Canyon Lakes Ranger District, I realize quite a bit that the liaison themselves are doing multiple things at the same time, trying also to balance the needs of the volunteers with the parameters and guidelines that are set by the agency in either how to do the job or in other work that comes up. And timelines usually do not fall into place. You're usually trying to do multiple things at the same time. And if you are in an area where you have a lot of recreation like we do, it can become quite complex trying to deal with everything at the same time, along with, I also did National Environmental Policy Act projects, helping out with recreation and fire and wildlife and other programs that the Forest Service had. So trying to balance everything, just understand that your liaison may have a lot of things going on at the same time. So give them a little bit of a break. Keep pestering them, as I told my volunteers, always keep pestering me. one thing may drive out another. The knowledge base of your liaison. Generally, I know I didn't know everything. I had to go look for answers for a lot of different things, especially when it came to doing special types of projects for fundraising on the National Forest, so that we weren't offering a guided trip or something like that that would conflict with our special recreation use permits. So there's things within each agency that have to be adhered to, and your liaison may not know all those, but they're the ones that should seek out the answer, and it just may take a little bit of time to get that. And hopefully, I know I was very lucky to have a lot of the really good specialists on hand, whether that was wildlife or special uses types of people that understood permits and things like that to help out my volunteer group where my knowledge was lacking. So, every liaison is going to be different, what they're specialized in, and so just understand they may have to look for an answer. Okay, so communicating. How do we get from here to where we want to go? Let's see. So nothing happens, of course, without communication. That works both ways. Nothing worse than a group of people looking at their own feet. That's really not what this picture is about. It's a scat session at a training, identifying what type of animal poop is on the ground. So that's what they're all looking at. Always trying to involve a bit of humor in what we do to lighten things up. We need to understand when you're working either with a liaison or a volunteer or volunteer group, where each side is coming from, what their needs are, what their guidelines or parameters are, what they can do, what they can't do generally, and what are the issues? What with the topic that you're dealing with your agency liaison with or with your volunteer group with, what is the main issue? Get that clarified so everybody's on the same page and not thinking that, oh, I thought you were talking about this and not this. So clarity of communication will really save a lot of heartburn down the road. Also, if there are impediments to performing a project, what are they? Get them out. There are probably more that'll come up as you start doing the project, and just realize that you'll have to deal with them. Hopefully not. If they're rather straightforward, like a trail or manning a visitor information station, those things are relatively straightforward, and you can get a lot of the things out of the way so they don't become problems while the project's ongoing, with a good pre-meeting down the road, and wrapping up what solutions there may be for that project. Okay, but again, communicate. When you're working with volunteers or a liaison, you can almost not have too much communication, making sure that we're all on the same page and working towards the same goals. Things get done a lot quicker and easier that way. And also, it's best sometimes to take a step back and remember why we're here. We're here for the resource. We're not here for our egos. We're not here, to get awards and glory and those types of things. Remember what brings volunteers to the table, and the reason many people work in natural resources is for the resource itself, so that it can go into the future and have the wonder and specialness that each area has for the public as a whole. So communication ensures that we'll continue to help the resource and the public that enjoys our public lands. It's the last paragraph there, and I think sums up pretty well. It's tying that communication in with the resource and making the resource basically live on its own as best it can in the current climate. I'm not going to get into climate change, although now that I'm not in the Forest Service and retired, I could. Sorry, another little joke. Okay, last slide, and then we'll open it up for questions. But a lot of things that go on, communication is the key. As you start in the upper left corner of this slide and go around clockwise, this was we had a flood event on our district and had volunteer interest early on. We looked at rerouting a trail on our district. There were 6 bridges, 5 of which were in wilderness. We actually relocated the trail. We made it with just 2 bridges, only one of which is in wilderness, not the one pictured here. This is outside of wilderness. But working the problem, working the solution all the way along with volunteers, getting up there when at the first opportunity to look and see what damage was done, and then in the spring again coming back to look, to take measurements, and then starting to form the bridge abutments. Once the bridge abutments were done, we had specialist help from the Forest Service with our engineers on this. Then I ordered up a bridge, and we had volunteers helping all along the way with building the abutments, building or putting on the stringers. Each one of those was roughly 1,500 pounds. And we had a Forest Service person that knew how to work a telehandler there, the extendable neck loader, and putting those stringers on. Volunteers then built the bridge, putting the decking and railing on. And as you can see, the finished project in the lower left corner there of the bridge that now is, hopefully if we get another flood like that, will withstand that flood and hopefully more. But that's where communication all along the way helped, and the public is now served by 2 good bridges, lowering our maintenance also on the trail from 6 bridges down to 2. And from all the comments I got from the public, it's a much better trail now, more sustainable, better views. So along with the volunteers who helped go out and help me line that trail out, a big thanks to everybody who worked on this. There's at least 60 volunteers at different times helping out. So big communication, but a lot of fun. And that took a couple of years to do all in all. So that is where my talk runs out. I will let Dave come back on, and we can see what questions we have and see if I can answer them for you.
Terrific. Thanks, Kevin. Second time I've heard this, and I pulled lots of new things from it. I have a couple of questions myself, so thanks again. Jenny asked a question which relates, I think, to that last slide. How do you handle the safety risk associated with having volunteers in wilderness? Did you implement any special protocols for wilderness work?
No, our protocols are pretty rigid anyway. Of course, you see the hard hats, long sleeves, long pants, hard boots. Those are all standard, what our volunteers have come to expect. For wilderness, I tried to keep group size to our maximum group size. Only once did we need to go over that limit when I just couldn't schedule different people. So I wrote a letter off that the ranger signed to authorize a group that was more than 12 heartbeats going in. But as far as safety, no, we didn't. There were no special rules set up for safety. We followed our continuous safety protocols that we always have in place. We weren't camping out on this one. Otherwise, if we had a large group, we would have split up, following leave no trace into different areas. And I have had volunteer groups go in and split up and then do different parts of the project. So organization of the project is key as the liaison to try and minimize administrative headaches, as well as just getting too many people on one project where they're banging around with each other.
Gotcha. Also a question from Phil. Hey, Phil, good to see your name here. So volunteers are not allowed to carry firearms, which otherwise they would be allowed.
Right, according to Forest Service policy, and you need to check with the agencies, the other agencies, whether they allow that or not. The only time I have ever heard that they've been allowed is if they are qualified up in Alaska, where, of course, for bears, they need to have something. But down in the lower 48, I haven't heard of groups that do that. And there may be, but not to my knowledge.
Thanks for that. I'll keep monitoring for questions from the audience, but one that I wondered about myself, the point where you say what the issues are as part of communication, clarifying what the issues are. We hear really nightmarish stories of liaisons and organizations somehow having enormous difficulty communicating back and forth. And I wonder whether you have any sense that a lot of the times that comes from a lack of clarification of what the issues really are. For one obvious example, that it's really about egos instead of about the job.
Yes.
Any thoughts?
Yeah, I think you're right, Dave. I think a lot of times it's just not enough clarity in what the project is, what it entails. And you have to follow through mentally the process of building the bridge, basically. Who's going to do what? How are we going to get the bolts through here, there, whatever? Sometimes that's not clear enough in everybody's mind. Or somebody just has a different idea, and be damned with how you want to do it. I want to do it my way. And it's like, well, if that way is better, then the liaison may choose to do that. I find, especially with trail work, there's a lot of good ways to do something. If somebody says, I prefer doing it this way, and it still works, I'm going to let them go ahead and do it. They're more comfortable with that. To me, it's just safer. It still accomplishes the job. But like a lot of things in life, there are many ways to do it, except when you're building a bridge sometimes, where every piece basically has to be bolted together in a certain way. And you just sometimes have to say, let me find you another project, or no, this is really the way it has to be for these reasons. So it's really seeing the end result already in your mind before you even build that bridge.
I've always admired the way you're very clear as liaison speaking to us volunteers. You're very clear when there's something we may not do that way, but on the things which are flexible, that you have allowed us that flexibility, that you're willing to say, yeah, that seems like a good idea. Let's try that out. But that you've also given us very clear guidelines at times. No, that's something that you cannot do that way. We got to put the bolts through the holes that we already drilled. So
right, or there may be a safety reason for not doing it a certain way, and that's my main mantra, as you know, Dave, is being safe. Nothing am I going to allow that I think is going to be unsafe. There's just too much paperwork involved in injuries. And of course, I don't want injuries anyway, but you know, it's if you can avoid adding the administrative nightmares onto a job, it's best to do that, even if it twists somebody's ego a little bit.
Yeah. Well, your mantra has always pointed to that you say so often. First, be safe, have fun, do a little work. It's a great order. We have a question here from Rachel. Our organization would like to educate our volunteers and the public about climate impacts on public lands by framing volunteer work around climate resilience. How can we best negotiate these topics with public management agencies?
How best to negotiate those with the agencies?
With public management agencies, yes.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I would say talk with the agency first of all, because currently they may not be able to co-sponsor or go along with that under the current guidelines that are out, unfortunately. But I think that's wonderful way of getting the public involved. And if you can do that, the best is to get the specialists involved who are involved with climate. So the air specialist, the person who deals with air quality, water quality, usually that can either be the fisheries biologist of a national forest or a district or a BLM office. They normally have those, a hydrologist sometimes stands in for that because they deal with those types of water quality issues also. But it would be talking to the specialist to see what you can do, what they need also, and then what they can do. Hopefully that answers the question.
Kevin, you might want to put up your face as well. It was just pointed out to me that you've only got my head there.
Oh,
Rachel, that's a great question. And I might just mention that the September 8 webinar is going to address climate change as it impacts public lands. That is still forming up, but I hope we'll be able to address some of that in that context.
Yeah, I think that would be a great project.
Yeah, that's a huge topic and one that I think many of us could be looking for ways to work on. I'm monitoring for other questions from the audience. Kevin, I have another one myself, and I don't want to distract from other people being able to come in. But as you throw up those lists of things which volunteers can do, and what we know from research that NWSA did back at the start is that the range of different things which volunteers are doing nationwide is quite extraordinary, and something that someone thinks volunteers can't do, someone else is doing. The initiative for those projects could come either from the agency side, someone needing help on something, and thinking, hey, maybe volunteers could do that, or from the volunteer side. Do you have thoughts about how both agency side and volunteer side could initiate contact around some imagined project?
Well, I will say that a lot of times the agency personnel aren't really thinking in terms of volunteers. They're trying to get their programs out. So if a volunteer sees something that they might like to do, you know, it's probably going to need to come from them. The agency personnel aren't always schooled in how best to recruit and go out and kind of publicize what they're trying to do. I mean, we're still working on a website for the National Forest that is completely hands off as possible by the agency personnel, so to speak. So it's not like every program's involved in what you see on the website. And I think if we were, each program were, we could probably get more involved with the public. Hopefully it'd make those pages more interesting to the public and maybe draw some interest in to get some work done. But as far as how best to go about getting projects out and advertised, that's a tough question. Small districts, small offices of whatever agency you're close to may not have the resources to do it. It may be up to the volunteer that sees a need and can go to the office and talk to somebody that has knowledge about that and see what they can do. Unfortunately, with staff cuts and more down the road, I just see agency personnel in whatever agency they're in completely overworked. And it's going to be a difficult time ahead, I think, for the natural resources ahead.
Yeah.
I know that didn't quite answer your question, Dave, but.
No, it's much of an answer. And one of the ironies, of course, is that the busier agency people are, the more difficult it is for them to look around, reach out, see ways to deal with that. I want to pass along a question here from Sunny. Does the Forest Service have any official policy regarding volunteer recognition? Is there a certain level of follow-through we as partners should expect on the agency's part?
There is a direction that we should recognize volunteers. There are for every 500 hours, I believe it is, there's supposed to be a pin that you get from the Forest Service. I know in our office, we were lucky enough to have Christy Wumpkus, who dealt with a lot of that and tried to ask people if they wanted the pin, because within PWV, we have people doing, 1,000, 2,000 hours a year, which completely blows by the 500-hour, what our guidance is. In the past, I tried to recognize, but these are all things that we did, other than the pin, which is what a little lapel pin type thing, our direction is. Now, each office, whether it's any agency, they can also set up their own program, how to reward volunteers. So I would say talk to the agency because recognition is important. And it helps the agency in a way, but it recognizes that volunteer for the service they have done. And unfortunately, no, there's not enough direction really in our guidance. It really is up to the individual office to come up with their own. So.
Okay. Mike asks, part of the presentation title is what should volunteers not do? Mm-hmm. You listed many activities that volunteers can do, but are there some that you think volunteers should not do? And I know part of that, of course, is the question of enforcement and such, but I wonder beyond that.
Yeah, no, really beyond that, I can see uses of volunteers in almost anything we do. Enforcement, of course, they shouldn't do. That's not, if you're not out there enough to understand what can happen, you can wind up in a world of hurt. So that's why law enforcement's just out in my book. Now, of course, authority of the resource, using that to talk to people about what they're doing is a little bit different, but even there with training, they hopefully can recognize when not to push the issue and just walk away. Other things that they shouldn't do, I just can't think of any. I mean, it is going to depend upon the volunteer themselves, what they're interested in. If they are a computer person and love to do maps and stuff, you know, our geographic information folks would love to have people come in and help them if they understand the Esri ArcGIS mapping programs and stuff. You know, if they don't want to go hiking, if they just want to kind of patrol in a way and go to our dispersed sites, clean up fire rings, pick up trash, you know, that's all good with proper training, of course. But no, I can't really think of much else without proper training that a volunteer can't do or shouldn't do. They can always ride along with a agency person to help them in what they're doing, which is an added safety feature because a lot of times agency people go out alone. So.
And I want to just quickly say that I think there are areas where volunteers can work more effectively, especially with the public, than agency people can. So finding that good balance.
Right. Well, and there are, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to add on, and there are groups out there doing water sampling for agencies, for lake chemistry to find out about climate acid deposition and nitrogen deposition. So there are things that you might not think of. If you're headed to a lake, maybe you can go grab a sample. Of course, you usually have to get it back within 6 or 7 hours to a tester, but you know, think outside the box a bit when you're thinking of volunteering.
Okay. Ryan has a question which would make a marvelous topic for another webinar sometime. So Ryan, thank you for putting it out here. I work for a nonprofit, and our biggest challenges with communication have to do with, first, Forest Service staff working Monday to Friday when most volunteers are active on the weekend. And second, Forest Service staff turnover. Good communication often goes hand in hand with good relationships that take time to develop. Does the Forest Service recognize these challenges? Have they thought about ways to address them?
You know, I'd love to say yes to that, but I think the truthful answer is no. It is, turnover is a fact of life. Me being at the location for 18 years is not normal. Normally, you'll have somebody for 5 to 7 years and then they move on in there. But, you know, the hiring of permanent people is a challenge. It normally takes anywhere after the person moves on from 6 months to a year to get somebody new on. In that case, you have somebody substituting for the person who left, dealing with the volunteers who may not understand the agreements, who may not understand, you know, the project completely that needs to be carried on. And strategically, does the Forest Service recognize these things? Yes, they recognize the downfall of people moving on or positions not being filled in time. A lot of times that's not within their control to deal with. So I hate to say it, but it's either it's not in their control or no, it's not something they really have time to pay attention to. It's hopefully they get somebody in and that person can take over and pick up and move on.
I think that on the positive side of that, I've heard stories of volunteers' historical memory on a given district, helping new people as they came in, bringing them up to speed.
Right.
A question from Miguel. How do you deal with lack of resources in training volunteers? We want them to help, but no training.
Well, you have to have training, even though you may not have the resources. You know, you might have to improvise. I'm not quite sure what resources you wouldn't have if you're getting volunteers on. But you need to have at least the talk about what the project is and the open communication as to how to get it done. Yeah, maybe if you need a special tool or something and there's no money for it, you're going to have to move on to another project because you want it done safely. And that's the key.
And I might add, Miguel, if you want to get in touch with me through NWSA, I'd be happy to think further with you about that and try to look at some of the specifics, see whether we can help.
And there might also be fundraising opportunities there too, or grants from either NWSA or other organizations to help out those low resources or non-existent resources that a group might have.
Yeah. Rob says, I don't see trail maintenance and packing support listed. These are the primary things that Backcountry Horsemen of America do with public land agencies.
Correct. And we've used Backcountry Horsemen here. You can use pack stock throughout almost any of these projects if it's required, or not really required, but if it's an opportunity to use pack stock. So it may not be listed individually, but it can be put under a lot of these different types of projects, especially for trails where we've had them pack tools in, bridge timbers, sand and gravel. Oh golly, so many things we use pack stock for. That it's to me, it's just, and I probably should have put it in a slide, that it's underneath a lot of these projects, different ways of getting the materials there, getting people there or their equipment can be done in a lot of different ways. Pack stock is one of those ways. So, oh yeah, most definitely.
Well, certainly all of us interested in traditional tools, especially have to recognize the extraordinary nationwide support that BCHA has given to groups everywhere.
Yeah, very true.
Sunny asks, declining budgets for recreation management are making the Forest Service job far more difficult. Is it appropriate for us as partner groups to encourage our volunteers to advocate for increased agency budgets?
Yeah, depending upon your group, if it's an advocacy group, definitely. Of course, the one I dealt with was non-advocacy, just boots on the ground group. But yes, what you'll want to do is you probably won't want to go through the Forest Service chain at all. You'll want to go direct to your senators and send them letters and say, you know, we'd really like to see more money funneled for this project or that project. Get as specific as you can. Maybe even invite the senator out to see what's going on. They are the ones that you want out on the ground. And I know ours has been out with us at least once. So I know he understands what's going on.
And you may have essentially said this, a lot of this depends on an organization's mission statement.
Correct.
Our home group is very careful to stay away from advocacy issues as an organization, but individuals still have their rights to go out and advocate for something they believe in. Other organizations do include some degree of advocacy in their statements. And once again, we have a webinar coming up that I look forward to terrifically much. April 14, Balancing Advocacy and Stewardship to Protect Wild Lands, from Lauren Barutich of the Great Old Broads. And I think that's going to be a great example of blending those two elements.
Yes.
Kevin, here's one that requires you to manage some of your slides there. Mike asks, would you be so kind as to show again the first list of what a volunteer can do? Our organization is typecast as a trail working organization. We want to branch out to other activities.
Is this the list here. This is the first part. This is what most people think of. These are the recreation things that occur. And again, you know, if you're doing backcountry, front country patrols, that can be patrols on stock or on foot. If you're in non-wilderness, of course, that can be bicycles also. And trail maintenance and construction, wilderness, non-wilderness, those types of things. And don't forget a number of the the volunteer groups themselves might need help on their boards for going for grants or going for funds to help do projects. So that's an important part of a lot of volunteer groups. And the liaison basically does the agency letter of support. I used to do at least 20 or so a year for different volunteer groups to try and go for money. So that was one of my duties as a liaison.
And Kevin, I wonder, you're the pro here, but let me suggest to Mike that this list of those things that you're probably most familiar with, if your group is just typecast and locked into trail work, and I know many groups are, that first list are all recreation management things, which many groups do. You wouldn't find opposition to that. People would understand that kind of job. And it seems to me that starting from saying, what do we want to do? What's the need here? What are our skills? Where would we like to be working? And then to let that bring you to, so how about if we tackle this?
Yeah, that's good, Dave, because if a group knows what their skill set is, that can go a long way into helping decide where do they want to go in a different direction.
Yeah. I often laugh about how many times our scope of action with Poudre Wilderness Volunteers has enlarged because someone has something they really want to do. And they come to the board and say, I really want to take kids out and show them what's out there. And someone on the board says, well, that's not our mission. And then someone else says, well, why isn't it our mission? And then pretty soon we've got Kids in Nature and we've got a new program. We did the same thing with weeds. And in fact, we brought trail maintenance in later, at first feeling maybe that isn't for us to do. And then finding that it was a very important and useful part of our job.
Yep.
I want to just mention a comment from Rob that goes back to the question of Monday, Friday versus weekend. I concur that having ranger stations closed on weekend is a major problem.
Yep, I agree. And of course, I worked weekends 9 months out of the year because I recognized that that's when the people are out there, not just the volunteers. So for me to get a good handle on what's going out in the field, I needed to be out there and see how the public was using things. Nowadays, people are thinking it's Monday through Friday or Thursday. Our office here is closed on Wednesdays now, which I disagree with still, because the public should be able to get in at least Monday through Friday to the office of the agency that they're trying to find out about or work with. And then on weekends, of course, if I could help out volunteers before I left for the field, I'd deliver equipment or whatever for them. So yeah, it's depends upon the local area and the local manager, the district ranger or the administrator as to when those places are open. And a lot of times they're thinking that so much more can be done through the web. And I think that's really a false hope. People still need the FaceTime and need to interact. So my little soapbox.
And a good one. Rachel says something which is to which I want to respond both individually and at the general level. I'd love to get a copy of this presentation to share this list of ideas with our volunteers. and she gives her email. And certainly we can arrange to send those to you, Rachel, just as PowerPoint slides. But I would mention to everyone that all of the previous webinars, and that'll include this one, of course, are available through NWSA. And I think gradually we're going to have a great resource, a great library of topics. You may not need it this year and may find that you need it next year. Okay, not seeing any more questions, and we are just at the end of our time. So Kevin, again, thank you so much. It was fun visiting with you this way, and I think just an enormously useful presentation. The flow of worthwhile questions says that you've really sparked interest, and obviously everyone, you can follow up with Kevin via NWSA and with me directly for any further things that develop. So I should close by saying that our next webinar is Tuesday, March 10, 1 o'clock. We try to do our webinars second Tuesdays at 1. We're going to be doing some very interesting stuff with Leave No Trace. So refresher for those of us who lose track of the principles, updates on some of those, and resources which are available to help you use L&T more effectively in your own group. Aaron and Bryce, who are terrific traveling trainers, are going to be taking the lead on that, along with Faith Overall, who is Leave No Trace's education and outreach coordinator, and also a volunteer locally here with Indian Peaks Wilderness Alliance. So with that, thanks to all of you for listening in. I hope this was helpful. Kevin, thanks again to you.
Thank you, everyone.
I'll see if I can figure out how to get us out here, because as we saw at the start, I'm not real familiar with the controls. So it'll be good to have Andy back. Thanks again.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.